Welcome back. You're listening to Make Planning Make Sense. My name is Aaron Zimmerman, and I'm a director at Centro Planning Consultancy.
My name is Alex Roth, a planner at Centro, and we'll be your hosts. In today's episode, we're going to give you a rundown of how we got to the town and country planning system that Aaron and I work to navigate day to day, and that the government is working to reform.
In the second part of the episode, we're going to be sharing our hot takes on what we can learn from how we got to where we are and where we're going from here.
As always, our email is podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Send us your comments and questions. We'd love to hear from you. Let's jump in.
Let's do it. We wanted to start with a few resources that might be of interest to our listeners. The first, and my top recommendation, is The Economy of Cities by Jane Jacobs. She's better known for The Death and Life of Great American Cities, but The Economy of Cities is an absolute masterpiece. The second thing I would recommend checking out is the case of the Broad Street Pump in Soho, where physician John Snow mapped cholera cases from an outbreak stemming from the pump. It turns out that John Snow did know something, because Dr. Snow's scientific approach to understanding a cholera outbreak was a seminal work in both town planning and epidemiology. So this study was amongst the first methodological approaches to understanding how land uses can relate to and affect one another. Now, previously, this understanding was more implicit or arguably more organic. Cities were already organized in a way that saw wealthy people living upwind and upstream from the smoke and sewage of city centers. But Dr. Snow's study brought scientific and intellectual rigor to the notion that the arrangement of land uses correlates with effects on health and quality of life. And in doing so, it set the stage for town planning as a distinct practice. And the third thing I want to do to bring us into the 20th century is to give a shout out to Ebenezer Howard, whose work inspired the Garden City movement. But I think that the value of Ebenezer Howard's work is actually more closely related to the social idealism that he sought to embody in a built environment. So those are a few things that you might already know well about, or you might want to do a little bit of your own independent digging on, but our more statutory journey begins just after World War II.
So in the mid-20th century, there were two very important pieces of legislation that really shaped the town and country planning system that we have today. The first was the 1946 New Towns Act, which continued on in that era, in that Garden City tradition that you were just talking about. And what it did was set up authorities that would deal with the design and development of new towns.
So that's sort of like a precursor to development corporations that we have today.
And then following on from that, the following year, you had that idea expanded to development more generally, and you had the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act passed. And so previously, landowners were, subject to some restrictions with what they could do with their land, but broadly speaking, they had a good degree of freedom. And then after the 1947 Act, any development is subject to planning permission, and that planning permission was to be granted by local authorities and in accordance with development plans. So those are the three kind of building blocks of the town and country planning system that we still have today. And unlike other countries, we did not go as far as to implement zoning.
Okay, so we've got discretionary decision-making by local authorities, and development is guided by development plans.
That's right.
Sounds awfully familiar.
Yeah. There were many benefits to nationalizing the right to develop land. You had a more coordinated effort over land use. We were able to preserve green spaces in cities. We were able to do the obvious, like keep factories away from homes.
Shout out back to Jon Snow.
Exactly. But the other thing we saw in the 30 years following the 1947 Act is we saw a noticeable decline in housing delivery rates relative to the interwar period. So you saw 2.3% growth per annum in the interwar period and only 1.8% from 1947 to 1979. And that's even with the
post-war housing boom.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. Not much happens then in terms of planning legislation between 1947 and 1990. But I wanted to point out two trends in the 1980s that continue to shape the planning conversations that we're having today. It was in the 1980s that the state really stepped away from its role as a major house builder. Around the same time, the government introduced the Right to Buy program, which allowed residents of social rented homes to buy those homes at a steep discount. social housing stock was depleted because of the right to buy program, and it was not replenished at the rate that it was being lost. The number of homes built by private developers did increase, but it did not fully meet that shortfall that was created in terms of annual delivery numbers by the retreat of the public sector as a house builder. And we also need to account for the population increases in that same time between World War II and today. There's a really interesting dynamic in our industry, and the 1980s captures this really well. There's a complicated relationship between planning as a regulatory system and development as a private enterprise, and the product as a public good, and in terms of housing, a human right. So starting to add this all together, we have house building rates fall from the interwar period to the post-war period, despite the post-war housing construction boom. Then we have housing delivery fall again when the state steps away from that role. Looking deeper into that data, we understand how the proportion of social rented units is decreasing because of right to buy at the same time. And then we get to the Town and Country Planning Act of 1990. I've seen this discussed as a series of sweeping reforms, but I would have to say that the sweeping nature of those reforms speaks more to changes to the process than changes to the outcome. So when people talk about the planning acts, the 1990 Town and Country Planning Act will be one of those. But again, it was still very much a planning system that looked like the 1947 Act planning system at its core, which is a discretionary system and a planned-out system. So we see in the 1990 Act that the government is conscious of the fact that the 1947 Act wasn't resulting in the outcomes that the state desired. And after the 1990 Act, I think that there's kind of a ramp up in the periods of reflection and review that we see coming from the government level.
Now, in 1997, along with many other reforms that they were keen to implement at the time, the Blair government set their sights on reforming the planning system, and they commissioned acclaimed economist Kate Barker to undertake a review of the UK's housing market. And the first Barker review of housing supply was published in 2003. The review found a supply shortage, which was distorting the housing market. It found that something odd was happening, which is that our housing was getting more expensive more quickly than the European average. So the UK real house price inflation rate over the previous decades at 2.4% had been higher than the European average at 1.1%. The report concluded that this was due to a historical underdelivery of homes.
Okay, so this is really good to see because we have this 1947 Act. From there, it's not really delivering what we need. Then we have the 1990 Act, and that retains much of the same basics of the planning system. Then we have the Barker Review that says, guys, this is not working. And so the government surely must have really pulled all the stops out to make sure that the planning system was delivering what society needed. Then we have the 2004 Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act, which is another one of those planning acts that we talk about today because it is also still in effect. Did it increase housing delivery rates to meet need? Alex, what do you say?
Well, if we look at the data, I don't think that the data quite supports that.
You're being very polite. The answer is no. So it doesn't. No.
It's
a big fat no.
To put it simply,
yeah.
No, Aaron, we know that it doesn't work because the Barker Review of 2003 found that housing was already incredibly unaffordable due to the long-term underdelivery of housing. So this is actually not something that we can correct very quickly. It's something that we need to act to correct for years of underdelivery.
So the 2004 Act didn't cut it, and government went back to Kate Barker. Is that correct?
That's right. So the government was keen to understand what could be done to really correct for this historical underdelivery of homes and the cumulative effect that was having on house prices. So in 2006, Kate Barker undertook another review of land use planning, and it broadly made 3 recommendations on how the planning system could be reformed to achieve better outcomes. The 3 recommendations were: 1, to make more land available for development. And we have efforts like that, which are still ongoing today. For example, the addition of grey belt in the 2024 NPPF. The second recommendation was to resource the planning system better. And one of the ways that Kay Barker had recommended to do that was to allow for more private sector resources to enter the planning system. And the third recommendation was to provide more certainty in the form of guidance and to make the planning process more certain and transparent for developers to incentivize more development to come forward faster.
It's kind of a cruel irony that the 2006 Barker Review recommends more resources for the planning system, and then in 2010, austerity is implemented on government budgets in response to the financial crash.
The irony is definitely not lost on me, Aaron.
Such unfortunate timing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is actual irony or Alanis Morissette irony, but either way, it's most unfortunate. Of course, that can be contrasted with the decisions of governments in other countries that took a more Keynesian approach to spend their way out of the financial crash. And austerity is with us to this day. And I think that it speaks to a really important point that a functioning government at every level is necessary to facilitate economic activity, including in construction, mineral operations, to provide materials for it. You know, the multiplier effect is ridiculous. And so if in 2006 the local governments were identified to be underfunded, then in 2010 there's austerity imposed, and now in 2025 those tightened budgets remain in place. We can start to identify a trend that if we don't properly fund local government as a gatekeeper in industries that are key economic drivers, then those industries and the positive economic effects that they have are going to be throttled. So safe to say that austerity did not increase housing delivery. Also fair to say that housing delivery was not at an acceptable level before austerity was imposed, but it certainly serves to make everybody's lives a little bit more difficult in the industry. And it also certainly slows down the determination periods and the ability for officers to be accessible to applicants and for that conversation to be efficient. So just adding to the pile at this point, the 2011 Localism Act set out a series of expectations in the spirit of local government and knowing what's what about communities better than the national government. That includes the duty for public consultation by applicants, the ability to designate assets of community value, and neighborhood plans.
And Aaron, there's a perception out there, I think, that enfranchising local communities is a good thing. Is there a flip side to that argument?
Well, I think it's hard to say that less participation or less enfranchisement in decision-making is a good thing. The flip side to that is that the people who are going to be affected most by new development are the people who don't live there yet because the development hasn't occurred yet. The other thing I'd say is that neighborhood plans are not necessary for decision makers to have an understanding of a local context and character area, because that would already be the case when an officer from the local planning authority is assessing and determining applications. When you ask enfranchised, discerning, wealthy residents with time on their hands who are able to get neighborhood plans through an examination in public and through a neighborhood referendum, do you want more homes in your area? They're going to think about it in terms of traffic, car parking, NHS GP waiting lists, and construction. They're not going to think about it in terms of the homes that we as a society need.
Yeah, exactly. There are a number of strategic objectives which need to be sort of managed at the national or regional level that are probably going to be unpopular at the local level, such as building those homes on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, and since we're looking at it through the lens of housing delivery thus far, I think it's very fair to say that neighborhood planning did not create an opportunity to provide more homes than what a local plan or a regional development plan already would have envisaged. And don't get me wrong, I do practice what I preach in this regard. I live in Whitechapel. I do not mind when applications come through in the area, even if they're not for residential uses, because I live quite close to the life sciences quarter that I hope to God will get permission soon. But just the last thing I want to say about the Localism Act is that it's good that neighborhood plans are actually quite hard to adopt, which means that there are very few that have actually been adopted and become part of development plans. Let's touch on the NPPF as well. That's the National Planning Policy Framework. This is a really important decision-making document that came about in 2012. It condensed hundreds of pages of national planning policy into, I think at the time, 50 or so pages of planning policy principles with the intention of making planning policy more accessible and legible. It also arguably made national planning policy more vague. Since its debut in 2012, it's been amended 6 times, sometimes with more nuanced changes and sometimes with more sweeping changes. And it was in the 2018 version where an LPA not having a 5-year housing land supply would be an explicit justification for applying the tilted balance in paragraph 11. So let's look back to the leaderboard of this one particular metric that we're using to track the efficacy of the planning system. Did housing delivery begin to meet housing need from 2012 or 2018?
Well, Aaron, as we've discussed, I mean, it's a really historical under delivery of homes. So it really can't be fixed overnight, and it's going to require really sustained effort to correct that historical under delivery. But essentially, no, as you say, a lot of local authorities are still struggling to meet their housing targets, let alone meet their assessed need.
I think it's really important to emphasize that even if we were meeting the housing minimum requirements in every LPA in the country, we would not be reversing the trend of historical under-delivery. We would merely be stemming the bleeding of the current and ongoing under-delivery. A course correction would be absolutely hitting it out of the ballpark every year for like 25 years.
Yeah. I mean, this has been an ongoing under-delivery of homes for the past 4 decades, if not longer. So it's going to take a while to correct this, and
we should get started.
Yeah.
It's going to take a long time to correct it, and we are not on a corrective course at the moment.
Yeah.
Looking then in our very recent past, we have the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act of 2023. This gave the government the authority to create further regulations. It preceded a change in government, so it remains largely unimplemented. But it's worth noting that NDMPs, the National Development Management Policies, are likely to be consulted on in draft form later this year. These would set development management policies nationally and help to replace the repetitive nature of local plans on key issues that are relevant to development nationwide. The question of whether or not it will actually simplify the planning process turns on how the NDMPs are drafted. It was the intention of the previous government that these NDMPs could be supplemented by local policy in certain cases. And if that is the case, then it will be just about as much variation as always, but maybe with some, with a floor to it.
Right. We really saw planning becoming more front and center on the agenda with that Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. But then in the elections in 2024, both parties really had that as a centerpiece of both of their campaigns. And the Labour government, as we know, is taking planning reforms very, very seriously as major components of their agenda. And the sort of crown jewel of their attempts to reform the planning system is the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. What are the most key changes that we would potentially see coming forward?
I don't know if I'd call any of them key changes, to be perfectly honest, except for with regard to compulsory purchase, because that is going to be a potentially very helpful thing for government to actually crack on with things that are identified to be in the national interest. At the planning level, however...
What are the less key reforms that we might see?
At the planning side of things, we have things like limiting the number of councillors that can be on planning committees to a number that just doesn't really seem to cut things down, at least in my experience.
What's the number there?
I think it's 11.
That's still a lot.
Yeah.
That's still a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot of councillors.
And you have a national scheme of delegation, but it includes things that, again, any LPA that's kind of busy already wouldn't be taking to committee. So you have household applications.
And we'll have mandatory training for planning committee members?
Mandatory training, because members absolutely enjoy being told what to do, right? I don't think that we can imagine that members are specifically acting out of innocent ignorance. I think that they're...
I heard on another planning podcast, Planning After Dark, shout out to the hosts of that podcast.
Shout out, ladies, we'd love to have you on here, or vice versa, please let us know.
But they had discussed sending committee members to summer school.
Yeah, that's all well and good, but what actually happens in a committee is that members are responding to their constituents, because that's how their incentive structure works.
Right. Now, Aaron, what about new towns? That seems like a promising way to deliver a bunch of new homes.
I'm actually a bit optimistic about it, but I think that it'll depend on how it's implemented, of course. The government's drive to build new towns, I think we should just call them new towns.
New towns, yeah. Right? Because we talked about new towns earlier in this episode, didn't we?
We've been there, we've done that.
All the way back in 1946.
Yeah, exactly. And, Milton Keynes, and then fast forwarding to London Legacy Development Corporation.
Yeah, new towns.
New towns, yeah.
I like it.
So those are actually grounded in existing statute, which is why, again, I kind of mentioned compulsory purchase earlier. I think that they're trying to make these new towns possible, both with a planning authority that they will create that has an identified vision for what that place should be, whilst also making the land affordable for the development partners to acquire it.
Okay. And Aaron, we talked a lot about local authorities being under-resourced and planning generally not being resourced enough. What about the increase in planning application fees? Do you think that's going to be a way to help resource local authorities to determine planning applications faster?
At the moment, I don't really think that there's that much difference between these and PPAs. I think if it's like a pick your own application fee, but for the LPA, it's also going to create a perverse incentive where a pay to play system becomes a relied upon source of revenue. Think about it in the way that a local police department might set minimum targets for issuing speeding tickets on busy roads because they need the money. And I don't really think that that is a good incentive structure to introduce. If the application fees are too low, they're too low, and they should be raised. And if the department isn't adequately funded, it should be adequately funded. But allowing authorities to name their price just won't be a seamless process, in my view.
Now, those are the changes coming forward in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. There's a few other changes coming forward as well that may have an influence on our planning system. We have a new London plan coming forward, Aaron.
Yeah, so they issued their first consultation document, sort of their version of an issues and options paper. And it was kind of like if you put it through like a summary AI tool, it would just be, oh God, there's so many homes we need to build. And I think that they do want to be sincere.
Yeah.
When the current iteration of the London plan went through examination in 2021, it was just sort of an accepted cop-out that half of each council's housing supply would be found on small sites that have not been allocated. And it was a bit of a kick into the tall grass because that's really just not happened.
Well, I think there was a real recognition of where we're at in terms of market conditions, because it's quite honest about the fact that we were starting to make a little bit of progress with housing delivery. And in recent years, that has really, really stagnated to the point where you have almost no sort of completions coming forward in some boroughs.
Yeah, I mean, some LPAs in London have really stepped up, and I just really have a lot of time for that.
Yeah. The last thing I'd like to mention is the introduction of a new AI tool for planning that was just announced by the Prime Minister a few weeks ago as sort of a way to speed up the planning system and use AI to help mitigate for some of that under-resourcing.
You had a hot take on this earlier, which I think kind of sums it up completely. I don't know how much time we want to spend on it.
This AI tool, it sounds very, very promising. I think that AI is going to definitely have some type of future in our industry. But I think that before we talk about AI, we need to talk about I, as in intelligence. What I mean is, before we go into AI, I don't think that we've sufficiently explored conventional means of data collection and processing and organizing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that we have a planning system as it exists of our own creation. And so we are not helpless to change it before or separately from AI coming in. I don't actually want to spend too much time on AI because AI, big press headlines, but it's not good enough and it's not actually addressing the problems we have.
I just give a quick shout out to the GLA's data and digital department, who have made great progress in trying to implement some conventional data processing and data tools such as the London's planning data map. So shout out to them. And I think that's something that we should roll out to the rest of the country as well.
Absolutely. A huge shout out to big data because it's really good at identifying what isn't going well. But until decision making includes a course correction for the priorities within the planning system, I think that human eye and technology eye, Aaron, but in the conventional technologies that we've known before AI. But we'll need to do an episode about this in the future. We'll absolutely have to do an episode about this in the future because I do think that AI will have a helpful place in planning. I don't think that it will ever be able to replace the vision and courage and experience needed to exercise decision-making in the discretionary system as it currently stands.
We'll be right back. Now, this was a lot to digest for our listeners, Aaron. Let's try to break it down. What are your top takeaways from our condensed version of the history of UK town and country planning?
It's a discretionary plan-led system where the local planning authority is the decision maker. With the potential exception of the 1960s, it has not produced enough homes to meet the needs of the society. I think it's also fair to signpost the fact that housing delivery is not correlated only with the 1947 Act or its replacement in 1990 or the further changes in 2004. There are economic forces, there are other regulatory forces such as building regulations that exist outside of planning that have had clear effects on housing delivery rates. But when we reflect on a system that creates a really wide gray area, then I think that we really need to ask whether the planning system as it works is what we want. And I say this with a heavy heart, but it actually really underscores the importance of our work in the planning system because the gray area is really, really difficult to navigate for somebody who's not fluent in all of the jargon and all of the precision of this case law and that policy interplay and yada, yada. As I say, it underscores the necessity of having a good agent on an application.
Yeah. So we started off this episode talking about how having a more coordinated approach to land use planning and introducing planning control was done for the purpose of achieving these public benefit objectives like better public health outcomes, not locating factories next to homes and things like that. And we've achieved amazing outcomes through that system. However, it's come at a cost, hasn't it?
Just really slowly. Insufficiently achieved.
Yeah, I mean, it's come at a cost on delivery of homes and especially on the affordability of homes, right? As you said, where our profession comes in and where our profession is really important is if you're going to have a system that becomes really complicated and puts a lot of the burden on development, you need to resource that system properly because otherwise that development is just not coming forward at all. I'm glad that our job exists, Aaron, so that we can help to both achieve those outcomes in public health and delivering green space and delivering sustainable modes of transport in any number of areas, while still helping to get that development forward and across the line.
Let's have a little fun and dig a bit deeper. Alex, what are your hot takes from today's discussion?
I think several battles have already been won or at least made significant progress. So look at, for example, what we've done with cycling in London. I mean, there's been a coordinated effort over the past, let's say, 15 years, and we've managed to really transform cycling in London as a viable and safe and healthy means of transport in London. I think there are other areas where we need to focus on now. We can't have everything. I think there are some places we need to prioritize. I think that government has recognized this to an extent in doing things like attributing weight to certain strategic objectives, like in the NPPF. I think there is an awareness that we're facing several crises. We're facing a climate crisis, we're facing a housing crisis, but we need to make some priorities.
Fair hot take and completely agreed.
What are your hot takes, Aaron?
For me, I think that we see a disconnect here between national government priorities and local government priorities. The NPPF is begging for homes, but it's not really enforceable except at appeal by a sympathetic inspector. And of course, like hashtag not all LPAs, a lot of LPAs are doing a lot of good work on this. But if the local political dynamic is resistant to development, there's not really an enforcement for that to happen. So I think in a way, the MPPF is just sort of messing about in the margins.
You're telling me significant weight is up for interpretation at the local level?
Yes.
Wait,
sorry, that was a bit quiet. Yes.
But if there's a disconnect between national and local policies, that seems like somewhat of an uncoordinated approach for an objective like reforming the planning system or delivering 1.5 million new homes that's so central to the government's agenda. What's going on here? Why are they going with such an uncoordinated approach?
Well, you used objective there as a noun, but think about it as an adjective. And then you can start to contrast that with discretionary, right? I mean, I think we need to grant the premise that the system's not resulting in the housing needs being met. And that's true, especially with regard to affordability. So, if I could put on my political science hat for a moment, the thing that affects the outcome of a system more than anything is the design of the system itself. And right now, the discussion on planning reform is framed as having two possible approaches. Right? There's the incremental approach and the radical approach. And since 1947, all of the changes have been incremental. The 1990 Act, the 2004 Act, the MPPF in 2012, none of these changes has gotten housing delivery to align with need. And people and the economy and the environment are prejudiced as a result. I did add environment in there, embodied carbon notwithstanding, by the way. So there's a mini hot take within my hot take. And look, I'm not really crazy about the term radical reform because it's not radical to fix something that isn't working. So, if we can take what we've discussed today and apply it to planning reform, I think we might be able to talk about it instead in terms of proactive governance versus reactive governance. Proactive governance would be like, I have a leaky roof. I need to replace that roof. I will set out the steps that will result in that roof being replaced. It identifies a need and then creates the mechanisms to fulfill that need.
So in terms of our planning system, what does that look like?
When we're looking at proactive and reactive governance through the lens of planning reform, all of the changes so far from the 1990 Act, the 2004 Act, the Localism Act in 2011, the MPPF and its 6 subsequent iterations have all been reactive governance. But, if I can extend the leaky roof metaphor, you've got a roof, it starts to leak, you patch the leak, the patch doesn't hold, another leak springs up, so you put out some buckets under the leaks, then the buckets get overfilled, so then you create a monitoring and emptying system to make sure that the buckets don't get overfilled. You can kind of see it as an accretive process. So if changes around the margins are all that's needed, then it's absolutely fine.
So what would it look like to get ourselves a new roof? What would a proactive approach to planning reform look like?
Well, to be perfectly honest, what I don't see in the planning and infrastructure bill is a proactive governance approach. I don't see an outcome-driven reform coming from this set of incremental changes that the bill is proposing. I think that a proactive governance approach in planning reform would begin with identifying the need. And I think that, we'll be talking about housing need a lot on the podcast because I think in terms of placemaking, our system does produce some really lovely places. I think it produces some perfectly banal places as well, and that's okay. But when we talk about need, I think that the need that we can really focus in on is housing supply and housing affordability.
But surely the government has thought of this already. Why do you think they haven't pursued a more proactive approach thus far?
I think there are two reasons. The first is that I think that it would take an incredible amount of political capital to fundamentally change the foundations upon which the planning system sits. The second reason is money. And I think that the system has relied on private development and especially private speculative development since the 1980s. And now that housing is so expensive to build and so expensive to occupy, and housing delivery is starting to fall, I think that we can look at these factors in combination and identify a market failure. Now, the way out of that market failure is politically expensive and it's actually just financially expensive because housing is expensive to build.
And is it worth, well, I'll assume that it is worth it. Why is it a worthwhile investment?
In terms of political economy, I think that we also need to remember that the government was elected on a planning platform, yes, but to what end, right? The government has identified planning and development as the ignition key for recovery back to a high productivity economy. And I think that that order of events is absolutely correct. I think it's a brilliant strategy. The challenge, though, is that for that ignition key to work, the planning reforms that are being implemented will actually need to result in delivery. So this position the government is in is really difficult. And I really sympathize with that. But at the same time, the stakes are high. And when it comes to these tough choices, the buck stops with Parliament. You know, there's no one else who has that absolute authority in direction setting, in public spending, to get us out of the situation that we're facing. Absent that political capital being spent and that actual capital being spent, then I think a lot of people in our profession and then also in the wider development industry could arguably be left to just hope for lower interest rates, lower construction costs, etc. And I want to recognize as well that we're not even 2 years into a 5-year government. I don't think anybody's actually still watching out for whether we're going to have 1.5 million net new homes at the end of this Parliament. But if government has something up its sleeve or something down the line that can actually get us to 300,000 homes per annum in the last year of its government, that's still a massive win.
So that's a lot of complexity to capture in one podcast episode, Aaron.
Episode 2. Yeah, I mean, it is just a podcast, right? We're talking about these things at a very high level. And there's all sorts of opportunities to say, well, but you haven't considered the grant funding, or you haven't considered the changes in the labor market with regard to construction, or you haven't considered house price stagnation or land banking, or you know, and we're really excited to talk about all of these issues in more detail as the podcast goes on. But for now, if we're just sort of setting the tone of the conversation that we want to be having and the contribution we want to be making to the public discussion, I think looking at these things in terms of proactive versus reactive governance is really important.
That's a wrap. Join us next week as we discuss architecture with Managing Director of T2S Architecture, Tom Slater.
Listeners, send us your questions. We talked about a lot today, and there are so many hot takes that we had to hold back on. So let us know what you are wondering, and we might be able to discuss your question on the show.
Reach out to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm Alex.
And I'm Aaron. See you next week. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch, then we'd love to hear from you. Please write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my colleague and co-host Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thank you so much for listening.